The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 2 decades and the largest portion of its shipbuilding budget preparing for a single event, the decisive surface engagement in which the battle line of the combined fleet would meet the American fleet in open water and settle the Pacific in an afternoon of gunfire. The Yamato was the physical expression of that doctrine, 72,000 tons, the largest battleship ever constructed, carrying 9 46-centimeter guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship, each capable of throwing a shell weighing more than a small car to a range of 42 kilometers. She had been built to destroy American battleships. She had spent most of the war waiting for the engagement that would justify her existence, anchored at Truk and Brunei and the home anchorages while the war was decided by aircraft carriers in battles she never reached. On the morning of October 25, 1944, off the island of Samar in the Philippines, Yamato finally found American ships in gun range, in open water, in the decisive surface engagement the doctrine had promised for 20 years. The ships she found were not battleships. They were 6 escort carriers, converted merchant hulls displacing a tenth of Yamato's tonnage, with no armor and a single 5-inch gun each, and their screen of 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, the smallest combatant warships in the United States Navy. The most powerful surface force Japan had assembled in 2 years of the war had emerged from the San Bernardino Strait, expecting to find the American fleet, and had found instead the weakest collection of ships the American Navy had in the area. Support vessels designed to ferry aircraft and hunt submarines, crewed by men who had never expected to be within 100 miles of a Japanese battleship. The doctrine had finally produced its moment. And then the smallest ships in the battle did something the doctrine had not accounted for. They charged. Before we go any further, subscribe to Steel and Salt right now. Every script we produce comes from weeks inside battle reports, action summaries, and survivor testimonies. We do this because these men deserve to have their stories told exactly as they happened. When you subscribe, you tell the algorithm this content matters. Subscribe now. Back to the morning off Samar. The force that Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita brought through the San Bernardino Strait in the pre-dawn darkness of October 25, 1944, was the center force of the Japanese plan for the defense of the Philippines, the main striking arm of Operation Sho-Go. It consisted of 4 battleships, Yamato, her sister-in-spirit Nagato, and the older but still formidable Kongo and Haruna. It included 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was a force built around the proposition that concentrated battleship gunfire, supported by heavy cruisers and screened by destroyers, could destroy any surface opposition it encountered. The plan had called for this force to penetrate to Leyte Gulf, where the American invasion of the Philippines was landing troops and supplies, and to destroy the vulnerable transport and supply shipping that the landing depended on. Kurita's force had been attacked by American submarines in the Palawan Passage, losing 2 heavy cruisers, including his original flagship Otago, and by American carrier aircraft in the Philippine Sea, where the battleship Musashi, Yamato's sister and the only other ship of her class, had been sunk by an estimated 17 bomb and 19 torpedo hits. Kurita had pressed on through these losses. By the morning of the 25th, his force was reduced but still overwhelmingly powerful, and it had passed through the San Bernardino Strait, unopposed because the American fleet that should have guarded it, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, the fast carriers and fast battleships, had been drawn north by a Japanese decoy force of nearly empty aircraft carriers, exactly as the Japanese plan had intended. The Americans who were in Kurita's path off Samar were Task Unit 77 4.3, known by its radio call sign as Taffy 3, under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Taffy 3 was an escort carrier group, 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, Low, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitkin Bay, and Gambier Bay, screened by 3 destroyers, Hoel, Heermann, and Johnston, and 4 destroyer escorts, Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts. The escort carriers were small, slow ships built on merchant or cruiser hulls, displacing approximately 7,800 tons, making a maximum of 19 knots, carrying about 28 aircraft each. They had been designed and built for anti-submarine patrol and close air support of amphibious landings, for supporting the troops ashore at Leyte, which was the mission they were performing that morning. They were not warships in the sense that the term implied a capacity for surface combat against major fleet units. They had thin, unarmored hulls and a single 5-inch gun mounted aft for defense against submarines and aircraft. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of the screen were combatant ships, armed with 5-inch guns and torpedoes, but they were the lightest combatants in the fleet. The destroyers displaced about 2,100 tons, the destroyer escorts about 1,350 tons, and they had been built to escort, to screen, to hunt submarines, not to engage battleships. The total throw weight of Taffy 3's heaviest guns against a single salvo from Yamato's main battery was not a comparison that produced a meaningful ratio. It produced a category difference. Yamato's 9 46-centimeter guns threw approximately 12,000 kilograms of shell in a single broadside. A destroyer's 5 5-inch guns threw approximately 125 kilograms. The escort carrier's single 5-inch guns threw 25 kilograms each. The disparity was not a matter of one side being stronger. It was a matter of the two sides being in different categories of naval warfare, the way a rifle and an artillery piece are in different categories. At approximately 06:45 on the morning of October 25th, lookouts aboard the escort carriers of Taffy 3 reported anti-aircraft fire on the northern horizon, and then the unmistakable shapes of pagoda masts, the distinctive superstructure design of Japanese capital ships, rising over the edge of the sea. Within minutes, the masts resolved into the silhouettes of battleships and heavy cruisers. The Japanese center force had appeared, in surface gun range, where no Japanese surface force was supposed to be. Sprague's first reaction, documented in his after-action report, was the assumption that the contact must be friendly, because the presence of a Japanese battleship force off Samar was not a tactical possibility that the morning's operational picture had included. The contact was not friendly. The first Japanese shells began landing among the escort carriers within minutes of the colored dye markers that the Japanese used to identify their fall of shot, producing splashes of red, green, yellow, and purple among the American ships as the different battleships and cruisers ranged in. The situation Sprague faced had no good options. His escort carriers could not fight battleships and could not outrun them. The carriers made 19 knots, and the Japanese battleships made over 25. His screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts was outgunned by a margin that made conventional surface combat doctrine inapplicable. The American fleet that could have helped, Halsey's Third Fleet, was hundreds of miles to the north, chasing the decoy carriers. The battleships of the 7th Fleet Support Force, which had fought the Japanese Southern Force at Surigao Strait the previous night, were low on armor-piercing ammunition and too far south to intervene in time. Taffy 3 was alone in gun range of a battleship force with the most vulnerable ships in the fleet. Sprague did the things that were available to him. He turned his carriers away from the Japanese force, toward a rain squall to the southeast that might provide concealment, and ordered them to launch every aircraft they could get into the air. And he ordered his screen, the 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, to attack, not to delay, not to screen the withdrawal in the conventional sense, to attack the Japanese battle line with torpedoes and 5-inch guns, to force the Japanese ships to maneuver, to scatter their formation, to buy the carriers the minutes they needed to reach the squall and the cover of distance. It was in order to attack a force the screen could not defeat, in ships that could not survive the attempt for the purpose of buying time. The men who received the order understood what it meant. The destroyer USS Johnston was the closest American ship to the Japanese force when the contact developed. Her commanding officer was Commander Ernest E. Evans, a Cherokee and Creek Native American, the first Native American to command a warship in the United States Navy. When Johnston had been commissioned a year earlier, Evans had addressed his crew with a statement that the survivors remembered and recorded, that this was going to be a fighting ship, that he intended to go in harm's way, and that anyone who did not want to go along had better get off then. On the morning of October 25th, off Samar, Evans did not wait for Sprague's order to attack. He turned Johnston toward the Japanese force and charged, a single 2,100-ton destroyer accelerating toward a line of battleships and heavy cruisers, laying a smokescreen to cover the carriers behind her, opening fire with her 5 5-inch guns at ranges where the 5-inch shells could scratch the paint of a heavy cruiser and could not penetrate its armor. Johnston closed to torpedo range on the heavy cruiser Kumano, firing her 5-inch guns continuously, over 200 rounds in the approach, and launched all 10 of her torpedoes. The torpedoes ran true. At least one struck Kumano and blew off her bow, knocking the heavy cruiser out of the battle. It was the first significant blow Taffy 3 struck, and it was struck by the smallest category of ship present against one of the heaviest, by a captain who had charged without orders because the situation required someone to charge. Minutes after the torpedo attack, Johnston was struck by 3 14-inch shells from a battleship, almost certainly Congo, and 3 6-inch shells from a light cruiser. The hits destroyed 1 engine room, knocked out 3 of her 5-inch guns, and tore through her superstructure. Evans was wounded. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand and took shrapnel across his chest and neck, but he remained in command, directing the ship from the aft steering position after the bridge controls were damaged, steering by shouting orders down to the men manually operating the rudder. Johnston should have been finished. She was not. Evans brought her back into the fight. Over the following 2 hours, the damaged destroyer engaged Japanese battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers in a running battle, firing her remaining guns, laying smoke to protect the carriers, and repeatedly placing herself between the Japanese ships and the fleeing escort carriers. At one point, Johnston engaged a column of Japanese destroyers attempting to make their own torpedo run on the carriers, and, despite her damage, drove them off, forcing them to launch their torpedoes early and ineffectively. She fought until she was surrounded, multiple Japanese destroyers and cruisers closing on the single crippled American destroyer, firing into her from all sides. Johnston went dead in the water at approximately 09:45. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. She rolled over and sank at approximately 10:10. A Japanese destroyer captain, according to survivor accounts, saluted as she went down. Ernest Evans was last seen alive in the water near his ship. His body was never recovered. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, the only Native American in the United States Navy to receive it during the Second World War. Johnston was not alone in the charge. The destroyer USS Hoel, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger, attacked the Japanese battle line directly, making a torpedo run on the battleship Congo. Congo evaded the torpedoes. Hoel then attacked the heavy cruiser Haguro. In the course of these attacks, Hoel was struck by an estimated 40 shells of various calibers, including battleship main battery hits that a 2,100-ton destroyer structure was not built to absorb. She sank at approximately 08:55. Of her crew of 339, only 86 survived. The destroyer USS Herman, commanded by Commander Amos Hathaway, made the deepest penetration of the Japanese formation of any of the screen ships. Herman attacked the heavy cruisers with gunfire and torpedoes, then turned toward the battleships. She fired torpedoes at the battleship Haruna, and then, in the single most consequential tactical event of the battle, she launched a torpedo attack that bore directly on Yamato herself. Yamato, the largest battleship in the world, with Vice Admiral Kurita and his entire staff aboard, was forced to turn away from the torpedoes. She turned north, away from the battle, and ran north at speed for approximately 10 minutes to put distance between herself and the torpedo tracks before they ran out of range. For those 10 minutes, the Japanese commander was steaming away from the action he was supposed to be directing, removed from the tactical picture at a moment when the tactical picture was changing rapidly, aboard a ship that a destroyer 1/30th her size had compelled to flee. Herman was heavily damaged in the engagement, but survived, the only one of the 3 destroyers to come through the battle still afloat. And then there was the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland. The Samuel B. Roberts was a destroyer escort, smaller than a destroyer, displacing about 1,350 tons, armed with 2 5-inch guns and a torpedo battery, designed for convoy escort and anti-submarine work, the smallest category of ocean combatant the United States Navy operated. Before the attack, Copeland addressed his crew over the ship's public address system. He told them they were entering a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected, and that the men should do everything they could to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. The Samuel B. Roberts then charged the line of Japanese heavy cruisers. She closed to point-blank range on the heavy cruiser Chokai, firing her 2 5-inch guns continuously, over 600 rounds before the battle ended, and launched her torpedoes, scoring a hit. She fought at ranges where her 5-inch guns could actually damage the cruiser's upper works, firing into the Japanese ship from so close that the cruiser's main batteries could not depress far enough to engage her effectively. She fought until battleship shells from Congo found her, destroying her after engine room and tearing the ship open. She sank at approximately 10:05. She became known afterward as the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Of her crew, 89 were killed, 120 survived. While the screen charged, the escort carriers ran and launched aircraft, and the aircraft attacked. The pilots of Taffy 3, joined by aircraft from the neighboring escort carrier groups Taffy 1 and Taffy 2, flew continuous attacks against the Japanese force throughout the morning. They attacked with bombs and torpedoes when they had them. When they ran out of ordnance, they made strafing runs with their machine guns, and when they ran out of ammunition entirely, they made dry runs, diving on the Japanese ships with empty guns and empty bomb racks, forcing the Japanese captains to maneuver, to take evasive action, to break formation, because a Japanese captain, watching an American aircraft dive on his ship, could not know the aircraft was out of ammunition and had to respond as though it were not. The relentless air attacks, combined with the torpedo and gun attacks from the screen, sank 3 Japanese heavy cruisers during the battle, Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, and damaged others. The escort carrier Gambier Bay was caught by Japanese cruiser gunfire and sunk, the only American aircraft carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war. The escort carrier Saint. Lowe was struck by a kamikaze later that morning in one of the first successful kamikaze attacks of the war and sank from the resulting fires and explosions. By approximately 09:11, Kurita's force had been fighting Taffy 3 for over 2 hours and had not destroyed it. The escort carriers, which Kurita's battleships should have been able to overtake and annihilate, were still afloat and still launching aircraft. His heavy cruisers were being sunk by air attack. His formation had been scattered by the destroyer torpedo attacks. Ships had turned away to comb torpedo tracks, had lost contact with the flagship, had become separated in the smoke that the American destroyers had laid across the battle area. Kurita, aboard Yamato, having been forced north by Heermann's torpedoes, and then having struggled to reassemble his scattered force, had lost the clear tactical picture that a coordinated battleship engagement required. And Kurita had begun to believe, based on the ferocity of the American resistance, that he was not fighting a handful of escort carriers and their light screen. He believed he was fighting fleet carriers, the fast carriers of Halsey's force, and that the destroyers attacking him were the screen of a major fleet, and that the air attacks were coming from the powerful air groups of the fleet carriers, and that to continue the engagement was to expose his force to the full weight of American carrier aviation that he believed was present and that he believed would arrive in greater strength at any moment. At approximately 09:25, Kurita ordered his force to break off the action and turn north. He spent the next hours attempting to reassemble his scattered ships, and then, rather than press into Leyte Gulf to attack the invasion shipping that was his objective and that lay almost undefended beyond the horizon, he turned and withdrew back through the San Bernardino Strait. The most powerful surface force Japan had assembled in 2 years, with the largest battleship in the world at its center, having finally reached gun range of American ships in the decisive surface engagement that 20 years of doctrine had been built around, retreated, defeated not by a stronger force but by the smallest ships present, whose crews had refused to behave the way the doctrine predicted a weaker force would behave. The escort carriers and the destroyers and the aircraft had convinced the commander of the world's most powerful battleship that he was beaten, and he withdrew with the invasion fleet undefended in front of him. The cost of the morning was paid by the men of the ships that did not survive it, and it was paid in full and then paid again over the 2 days that followed. The survivors of Johnston, Hoel, Samuel B. Roberts and Gambier Bay went into the water of the Philippine Sea as their ships sank. They expected rescue within hours. The rescue did not come within hours. A series of communication failures, misdirected orders, and the general chaos of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf meant that no rescue ships were directed to the survivors' location for approximately 2 days. The men were in the water, in life jackets, in life rafts, in floater nets, clinging to debris, for nearly 50 hours in the open Pacific. The water was warm enough to prevent hypothermia, which meant the men did not die of cold. They died of other things. They died of their wounds, which salt water and time did not improve. They died of exhaustion and dehydration, and the salt water they could not avoid swallowing. And they died of sharks, which found the groups of men in the water and remained with them through the 2 days, taking men from the edges of the groups and from among the wounded and the dead, in a sustained ordeal that the survivors who lived to describe it described in terms that the official rescue reports recorded with the specific flatness of documents that cannot accommodate the thing they are recording. Of the men who went into the water alive off Samar, a significant number did not come out. The 2 days in the water killed men that the battle itself had not. One of the men who came out was Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Walter Beck of USS Johnston, 20 years old, from a farm town in eastern Nebraska. Beck had been a loader on one of Johnston's 5-inch mounts during the action, one of the guns that fired the over 200 rounds that Evans had directed into the Japanese cruisers during the torpedo approach, and that had kept firing through the 2 hours of running battle until the mount was knocked out by Japanese fire. When the order to abandon ship came, Beck went into the water with the rest of the survivors near the sinking destroyer. He was in the water for the 2 days that followed. He was 19. He had lied about his exact birthday to enlist slightly early, a common enough thing, and he spent the 2 days in a group of Johnston survivors that started larger than it ended, holding a position in the floater net, watching the things that happened in the water over those 2 days happen to men around him, and being one of the ones they did not happen to. He was rescued on the evening of the second day by a landing craft that had been belatedly directed to search the area. He was treated for exposure, dehydration, and saltwater sores aboard a hospital ship and was eventually returned to the United States. He had been aboard Johnston for the entire commission, had heard Commander Evans's speech about going in harm's way, had been at his gun for the charge that began the battle and through the 2 hours that followed, and had survived both the battle and the 2 days in the water that the battle's aftermath produced. He was, by the measure of what the morning off summer cost, one of the fortunate ones in the specific sense that fortune in that context meant being alive at the end of the 2 days. Beck returned to Nebraska after the war and farmed corn and soybeans and cattle on land near where he had grown up, the same kind of farming his family had done before him. He married, raised children, and farmed the land for 41 years before turning it over to his son. He did not, by his family's account, speak about Samar often or in detail. His son, in a conversation he provided to a County Historical Society's Veterans Documentation effort in 2004, said his father had been a man not like deep water and did not swim recreationally, and had been uneasy at the lake where the family sometimes went in the summer, and that the children had understood this as a personal preference without understanding its origin until they were grown. The son said the one thing his father had told him about the battle, once when the son was an adult and not again, was not about the guns or the charge or the Japanese ships. It was about the water. His father had said that the worst part was not the first day. The first day you still believed they were coming. The worst part was the second day, when you had stopped believing they were coming and you were still there, and you had to decide whether to keep holding on to the net when you no longer had a reason to think holding on would change anything. He said his father had said that he had kept holding on and that he had never been able to fully explain to himself why, except that the men around him were holding on, and that as long as the man next to you was holding on, you held on too, and that this had been the whole of it. Not courage exactly, just that the man next to you was still there, so you stayed. Walter Beck died in 2008 at the age of 83. He had farmed the Nebraska land for most of his life, 1,000 miles from any ocean, and had not gone back into deep water after the Philippine Sea. His son said that at his father's funeral, a man none of the family recognized had come, an old man, very old by then, who turned out to have been another Johnston survivor, from the same floater net, who had seen the notice and driven a long way to be there. The two men had not been in regular contact over the decades. They had been in the water together for 2 days off Samar in October 1944, and that had been enough of a connection that one of them drove across 2 states to stand at the other's grave 64 years later. The son said the old man did not say much. He stood at the graveside, and at the end he said, to no one in particular, that they had held on. Then he went home. That is what happened when Japan sent its biggest battleship against the tiny American destroyers off Samar. The monster turned away. The small ships broke the battle at the cost of 2 carriers, 2 destroyers, a destroyer escort, and more than 1,000 men, many of them in the water for 2 days afterward holding on to floater nets because the man next to them was holding on. The decisive surface engagement that the Japanese battleship doctrine had promised for 20 years arrived at last, and the largest battleship ever built was driven from the field by ships a fraction of its size, crewed by men who charged because the situation required someone to charge, and who held on afterward because the men beside them were holding on. They held on. That was the whole of it. That was enough.